Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design today. For me, biophilic design has the potential to heal more than just our physical and mental health of people, but it has the potential to help heal our Earth too. If we implemented biophilic design in cities, for instance, we can help mitigate climate change, even by just planting more trees, which is obviously a biophilic design solution. We can increase tree canopy cover, obviously increase biodiversity, mitigate flooding. There's many more, including from creating blue cities with cleaner rivers, waterways, planting on roofs, sides of buildings help reduce the need to switch on air conditioning units in the summer, and of course heating in the winter, obviously, which is reducing energy consumption. Also, as interior designers who specify biophilic design, we're specifying more natural materials, reducing plastic, and also more considerate of what the textiles are made of and also originate from. With our global temperature reaching a danger point, we need to do all we can as designers, architects, fit-out managers, and anyone who works in the built environment at any point. And today, we've got the amazing Jojo Mehta with us on the podcast. Jojo is CEO and co-founder of Stop Ecocide International. It's the hub of the global movement to create a new international crime of ecocide to protect the earth from the worst acts of environmental damage, a movement that's gaining significant political traction. She co-founded Stop Ecocide International with a visionary lawyer, Polly Higgins, who died in 2019, having devoted the final decade of her life to the cause. I want to explore and put into context just why we need to do more as designers, seize every opportunity so we can create better environments, not just for people, but for planet too, but also how biophilic design is an essential part of that solution. Jojo, welcome. And it's a real honor to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Lovely. Well, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please? Kind of what you do and what got you into protecting the planet.
Wow. Yeah. So our organization, Stop Ecocide International, is, I suppose you could call us a sort of advocacy and sort of advisory organization now, really, we've become across the world. And we kind of operate on two levels. So, our primary objective is to support and to sort of drive forward, I suppose, the movement to legislate, to criminalize the worst harms to nature, as you just said. To make ecocide a crime. And so our sort of, two areas of operation, I suppose, are working with diplomats and politicians and legal advisors at that sort of high level. That's mostly closed door work around the sort of practicalities and the politics of moving that forward. And what's more visible, I suppose, is our very broad sort of advocacy role in terms of growing the conversation around legislating for ecocide, because as anyone who's sort of worked with, changing things at the political level knows, no politician wants to be the first to a party. It has to be a conversation that's safe to have. And of course, the broader that conversation is, the truer that is. So those are sort of our sort of two areas, I suppose. We track, we document, we talk about the developments around ecocide law around the world that obviously then helps to grow that conversation. So personally, gosh, well, I got into this, I suppose I first met Polly Higgins, the remarkable pioneering barrister with whom I co-founded this organisation in 2017. We first met actually a few years before that in 2014. I mean, I'd heard of her work, and obviously it felt sort of such an intuitive response to the sort of mass damage and destruction we've been witnessing over recent decades. Is, give it a name, ecocide, and say it, we just can't do it anymore. It just felt very, very logical. But I guess my particular way in was, at the time I was very involved with the quite sort of on the ground activism, sort of and the anti-fracking movement in particular in the UK. I had this, I mean, and I think, to be honest, everyone that comes from this, I suppose what is thought of as an activist perspective, has usually had a moment of sort of wake up or of outrage of something. And for me, that was fracking. I mean, I'd been what you might call a sort of armchair activist in the background of, what else I was doing in my life. And it was when I discovered about fracking, or hydraulic fracturing, which is this very polluting way of bringing oil and gas out from deep under the ground, involves sort of high pressure chemicals and And it's very polluting. And when I discovered that it had been established in America already and was, people were considering bringing this to the UK, so that was probably about 2013. I just remember thinking, this is insane. I couldn't see any angle from which it worked. I mean, whether that was economic, whether it was environmental, well-being, all of these different aspects. And I remember talking to my friends about it. And my little daughter was just 5 at the time. And she overheard me having the conversation and she burst into tears. And I was like, sweetie, what's wrong? And she said, Mummy, I don't understand. If they're poisoning the ground, they're poisoning themselves. You have to call them and tell them to stop. They're going to die. And it was just this moment. I just remember thinking, it's so obvious to this 5-year-old, to my daughter. How can this not be obvious to everybody? And it was a kind of, it was. I think it was a moment that kind of got me out of that armchair with sort of boots on the ground. I started researching, really informing myself, writing and publishing leaflets, giving talks, organizing demonstrations, all of that. And it was through that, I suppose, that I first started working with Polly, who just moved to this area of the world, which is a rather beautiful area of England, the Cotswolds in the West. And she was gathering research together for a possible case around fracking. And some mutual friends said, oh, well, you need to talk to Jojo. She knows all about that. And within half an hour of speaking with each other, we were pretty much sitting there going, well, we're obviously working together. There was such a kind of kindred spirit about the way we both work. I mean, I guess we both had a bit of a sort of a maverick approach, but also I think it was also there was a sort of level of pragmatism that I loved about her, and that really resonated with me as well, which is this sense of we may not know exactly how we're going to get where we think we need to go, but we can see where it is, and we can look at what we've got around us and think, how do we use what we've got, or how can we apply what's available to us to move it forward? So it was that very kind of improvisational, but also very pragmatic kind of energy, I suppose, that was at the heart of this.
Yeah, fantastic. And because you've achieved so much as well, haven't you? I mean, you sort of got in front of like world leaders and just really making a massive impact globally. I mean, did it obviously it started in the UK, but then it sort of grew from there, it sort of tentacles. What was the kind of journey of that?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, Polly had already established, I mean, she'd started talking about ecocide and the criminalization of ecocide, partly because she had discovered that when the sort of before the treaty that set up the International Criminal Court in The Hague, before that treaty was drafted, there was a sort of a precursor that was being discussed in the 1990s, which was called the Draft Code of Peace and for the Peace and Security of Humankind. I'm not sure I'm remembering the name right, but and there was discussion of the potential creation of a crime around severe harm to nature. And so I think the way Polly saw the last sort of decade of her life almost was kind of replacing an international crime that should have been there in the first place. So when the Rome Statute was drafted, which became the governing document of the International Criminal Court, we ended up with just 3 crimes at the time: war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. And the crime of aggression was added later. But if we just think for a minute, that court opened its doors 22 years ago in 2002. Now, if it had ecocide included at that time, you can imagine we might be living in a very, very different world.
Yeah.
And so when Polly discovered this, I think it was around 2009, 2010, this, it became the focus of what she was doing. And she was actually offered the opportunity to run a mock trial in the UK Supreme Court, the new building that had just been built around that time. And in 2011, they held a mock trial with an Ecocide Act that she had drafted that was kind of like, I suppose it was like an experiment, could this be a viable criminal law? And the conclusion was that yes, it could. And as a result, Polly's profile suddenly, she became better known around the world, and she'd built up this following. But at the same time, the idea was still considered quite radical. And so at that time, it was quite hard to find, for example, grant funding to work on, what was ultimately going to be a diplomatic job, and sort of, communicating with governments. And so I suppose we kind of realized this over time. I mean, for the first couple of years, I was much more sort of on the ground activism, and she was sort of, didn't really want to be seen as that. She was the kind of the lawyer, the sort of smart dressed, sort of talking to, the high profile. But what we realized is that it was hard to support this concept at the time, and we ended up kind of, if you like, joining forces. I mean, I was more than anything a communicator. And she obviously had the legal background, and creating this public campaign and sort of converting, if you like, her initial following into a membership. And so that's how we started. But actually, ironically, and well, tragically, really, but also perhaps quite humanly, it was actually when Polly passed away from a very aggressive cancer, it was very rapid at the beginning of 2019, that the organization started to grow. Because, I mean, it's that sort of crazy thing of when you have a strong figurehead for something, and Polly definitely was. She was hugely charismatic and inspiring. People sort of sit back a bit, and they sort of think, well, Polly's doing that, so maybe I don't need to. It's in hand somehow. And so, of course, when she was no longer there, what actually happened was that people started to get in touch with me. And what we discovered was that, there were, I mean, at the time, there were just, it was just really me, a few legal associates and a few volunteers, and that was it. But suddenly, sort of lawyers, campaigners, interest groups, people from around the world were getting in touch saying, how can we help? How can we help you? How can we make sure that this work doesn't die with her? And that turned out to be the beginning of what became a kind of gigantic dot joining exercise over many years. And I suppose, to get a little, I mean, just we can go into it in more detail, but just as a brief sense for the moment of how fast and how far this has moved. I mean, when that happened, there were no governments talking about this.
No.
And this year, literally, a couple of months ago, the EU formalized a new directive which addresses ecocide level crimes.
Amazing.
Or crimes that they're calling comparable to ecocide. And, for international law, that's kind of rocket speed. It's been extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's phenomenal. The kind of as you say, the speed. But I think that also shows, I mean, the passion. I mean, you need someone at the front, really, like at the front of the rocket, to really push it forward. To communicate it. You need like the facts and figures, if you want, and sort of being able to dot the I's and cross the T's and have that sort of gravitas. But you also need, to have that dynamism and so it sounded like the pair of you were like this perfect union of like passion and ideas and wanting to do the right thing as well. I
think you're right. I mean, in the sense that I think that there's actually a very strong moral element to this work, because and I think this is also why Polly focused on criminal law, because criminal law is that part of the system, if you like, that most closely touches on morality, on what we consider acceptable and not acceptable. And actually, I was recently asked to summarize in 10 points everything about this work, which is actually quite a difficult thing to do. But what it made me realize is that, on a legal level, it's very specific what we're aiming for. We're simply saying, if you like, add this crime to the list of existing crimes. It's perfectly possible to include it within an existing system. At the same time, there's this sort of parallel element, which is this sort of moral/cultural element. And what that speaks to is really at the heart of our global predicament, because what we have sort of on a planetary scale right now is the sort of result, if you like, of a cultural attitude, which has obviously come out of the Western canon, because that's what's come to dominate the global economic system. It's this sort of attitude that's actually been centuries in the making, which is very kind of dualistic, which separates us from nature, which has us feel that, we're the lords and masters, nature is an infinite bank of resources. And, and maybe when our economic system started, had its beginnings 200-300 years ago, whatever, people actually genuinely thought that nature was an infinite bank of resources. Of course, we now know very much that that's not the case, but it's also a very unhealthy attitude. And it comes from, this, I mean, it really comes from sort of centuries of that division between, and you can see it in the Catholic Church, spirit versus body, but you can also see it in the Enlightenment with, science and reason being pitted against emotion and nature kind of thing, so this kind of dualism. And so, it's like, yes, we may have a few sort of super villain types, I suppose, on the planet right now. But generally speaking, those, for example, the large corporations that are potentially as this sort of collateral damage, really damaging the planet, and not necessarily doing so because they're sitting there stroking their white cats and trying to plot destruction. It's actually that they're the logical result of a mindset that has happened. This the situation we're in now is the logical result of a mindset that's evolved. And of course, with criminal law, what you're doing is you're sort of tapping into at some level those boundaries. So people often have, and one of the things we end up describing and sort of explaining the most is that when you talk about criminal law, people often kind of run down a dark alley with a knife in their mind, because crime is what we associate with those kinds of things. But of course, it's criminal law that draws those moral lines, and also that protects us. So, a crime of murder, yes, you punish murderers through the fact that that's a crime, but that's not really the point. The point is to stop people killing each other.
Exactly.
So people forget that it's the fact that criminal law is a protective law, and that effectively when you draw that line around serious harm to nature. And of course, at the moment, most environmental laws are not in the criminal sphere. There are some, but not many. When you put that on a parallel with a serious crime, you're creating a moral atmosphere around that. You're also saying so you're saying it's just as bad and wrong, but also just as dangerous. To destroy ecosystems is to destroy people. So there's a really profound sort of cultural what would you call it? I suppose a disruptor, or potentially a kind of change making. I mean, we sometimes think of it as an acupuncture needle, something very, very precise that you can sort of insert within the system, but it affects the whole kind of nervous system, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I really like, I mean, you're saying about, and it's so true. We have been using nature. We've been separating ourselves from nature, and this whole sort of like the biophilia, the biophilic movement, if you want, from this side, the sort of bio meaning life and philia meaning love, and E.O. Wilson's kind of book just actually refers, and this whole thing refers to our innate connection to nature and to life and living systems. And when we cut ourselves off from it, we get sick. And obviously, when we've cut ourselves off from it, using it, exploiting it, and our planet's got sick, and then ultimately we're getting even sicker because our planet is completely imploding. So for me, biophilia is like actually that reconnection. So it's like the sort of holistic union of us and life and living systems and nature. Everything that sustains us. We are nature. We're not separate from it. And I think in terms of designers are really, really, really who really embrace biophilic design are really trying to bring that connection back into the built environment. It's I mean, yes, some people kind of think it's just putting a plant in the corner, and yes, that is, and that, it has its benefits.
Exactly. I mean, that's the sort of tiniest thing, but really, I mean, I think it's hard to overstate the importance of design, actually, because I think one of the things that that really rings true to me is that after Mother Nature herself, human intention is actually the most powerful force on the planet. Everything that is around us, everything about our society, everything about our built environment, of course, everything sort of physical, cultural, etc., that's around us is here because, if you like, we dreamed it up. It's here because human beings at some point have intended it, directly or indirectly, to come into existence. And this is one of the things that I sometimes find that we're confronted with when people say, well, is it realistic to expect the law to change and to expect it's like, well, hang on a minute, the reality that we live in is here because people intended it to be here. And therefore, when we're talking about reality, what our actual question should be, well, what is your intention? What is your design? What is it that you're actually intending to come into being in the near to to medium term? Because we're the ones that are actually creating that. So when people say, when sort of pessimists say they're being realists, I say, look, it's not about that. It's about, what do you actually want to see in reality? Because, it's our design, it's our intention and our design at this stage, which brings that future into being. And so, the whole sort of area that you're dealing with biophilic design and with, sort of the built environment, I mean, all of this is absolutely core to this. So important.
Yeah, exactly. And it's and like we just you know you're saying this whole thing about moral and ethics and doing the right thing. I mean, when I sort of lecture on biophilic design, if I've got a bunch of interior designers in front of me, particularly, it's like, what is your code of ethics? What's your legacy going to be? What are you going to do? I mean, yes, okay, and they always sort of, well, not all of them, but some of them come back and go, oh yeah, well, it's hard to find the right product at the right price. And it's like, yeah, okay, it is hard to find the right product and the right price, but if you're specifying it, you have a choice about what you specify to that client. So you could say, well, actually, I am not going to choose that. That's my code of ethics. I am not going to choose the plastic. I am not going to choose all this stuff. I'm actually going to find the natural materials, the linen, all the stuff that's sustainable or recycled or whatever it is. And that's the things that you specify. I think the whole supply chain story, anyway, I think manufacturing, I think all of that,
Mm.
needs to be really like shaken up and given a slap, I think, with a wet fish that's sustainably sourced, of course. But
Yeah.
I kind of there's just something that needs to be done, I think, really.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think obviously there are very sort of specific, on the ground sort of choices between, whether you're looking at sources of paint, whether you're looking at sources of, I mean, very sort of very specific things that perhaps what I'm talking about feels like a bit distant from. But at the same time, putting in place those overall parameters, those overall frameworks really speaks to the production end of the value chain. It
Yeah.
speaks to the highest sort of decision making that happens at the top of government and industry. And all of that directly affects the choices that that designers are given, that interior designers and built environment and architects are given. But of course, it also it channels what is then available to clients, to consumers, or to, as I would like to think of us, as citizens.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that I suppose you might call it the corporate PR machine, has done a really good job of in the last couple of decades, is making people feel individually responsible for the state of the planet.
Absolutely.
Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, we all need to take responsibility for the choices we make. I mean, that goes without saying. And, if we can vote with our wallet, we should do so. But the reality is that the vast majority of people on the planet actually can't afford to do that, even in developed countries. And therefore, actually, what is offered them, and that is something that comes down ultimately from those top decision makers, needs to be better. It needs to, it needs to be healthier. And if we're going to do that, we must put the rules in place that constrain the decisions made at the top level. And that is where ecocide law comes in particularly. And so it does have these really sort of like, sort of downstream knock-on effects to, the entire sector that you're speaking with, but actually to all sectors. And I think it can also give this sense, really convey a bit of a sense of hope, actually, because I can really understand how people are frustrated, despairing, feel a bit helpless, in the face of the sort of level of crisis, if you like, that is facing us. And it really is a kind of everybody needs to be on board, and for everybody to be on board, those who are in those key decision making positions need to have parameters that they have to operate by.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you say, having something right at the top, so that we talk a lot about legislation here. I mean, we talk about planning, all that kind of thing. And for instance, like the Department of Education is actually now woven into like specification when it comes to like putting in new schools and all this kind of thing. It's like biophilic design has to be in there, but unless it's specified or unless there's accountability as
Yeah.
well, like you say, an ecocide law, if a country is saying, well, actually, I've destroyed all these rainforests. I mean, I didn't even realize we had like ancient oak rainforests here in the UK. And I mean, they're just being, I've just come back from Uganda. I do a lot of sort of NGO work and stuff and humanitarian stuff. But I've just come back from there, and a few years ago they were saying about how they were destroying the forests, and the sort of nomadic tribes were sort of moving up and down, and they're trying to stop this like nomadic corridor, which I understand, but then they're not, there's this sort of like there's lack of joined up thinking, isn't there?
Yeah,
There seems to be,
absolutely.
and it's obviously it's political. There's always people always trying to line their own pockets or whatever it is that they're doing. But if there's not like a law like this, like an ecocide law, if there's not something there which holds them to accountability on an international scale, they're going to carry on doing it.
Well, this is the thing, and I think what you've hit there is the sense that we have now, which is that, I mean, it's unavoidable. You know, we're so global. The economic system is so global, that, you know, raw materials and economic transactions are all, you know, I mean, not all transboundary, but so many of them are now, and involve, you know, supply chains that cross the world. They involve, you know, transactions and potentially deals that, you know, that are absolutely not restricted to where the product is going to end up by any means. And in fact, you know, our conversations now, and we're having, you know, lots of conversations going on in the African region, in the Latin American region, and so on, where in these countries which are, you know, one might call the producer countries, where very sort of resource rich, but which have effectively been subject to kind of predatory, you know, economic activity. And actually, one of the things that you know, that ecocide law provides in that context is a way of holding those companies to account, and that's really important. And I think, you know, that there is, you know, we have, as a sort of, I suppose, a Western-based global economy, you know, we have effectively sort of plundered some of these most incredibly fragile ecosystems, and there simply hasn't been a level of deterrence in place for bad behavior, and indeed often there isn't. You know, often I think this is interesting, and it comes up when people say, well, you know, how can you put ecocide alongside genocide and war crimes, for example? You know, clearly we're talking about serious effects. We're not talking about chopping down trees on the village green. At the same time, the nature of the crime is different. So it's not like genocide, for example, where the definition of that crime is that you have to intend to destroy people, right? Now, with the environment, it doesn't work like that. It's very rare that anybody would actually set out deliberately to destroy the environment. What they're setting out to do is extract resources, or, you know, create profits, or, you know, whatever it is, industrial level agriculture, or whatever the particular activity is. And what you have is this huge collateral damage, and that tends to be, you know, sort of written off in the balance sheet, and I think the other thing that happens a lot in the environmental world is that, you know, obviously there's a balance. You know, we can't build a house without, you know, at least killing a few insects. I mean, you know, effectively there's no way we can not touch the environment. That's the whole point, is that, you know, we live, we eat, we exist in ideally, of course, in collaboration, in a biophilic collaboration with the environment. But what we've lost as a culture is the balance. And so, you know, we need to sort of put these sort of parameters in place to prevent the worst harms. But what that does is it does something a little bit different to environmental regulation, of which there is plenty, and you know, your sector will be well aware of this. But what we have found is that there is a tendency sort of globally to not take environmental regulation terribly seriously, particularly not with, you know, I mean, these big companies are often doing, you know, they're often making equations and working out for themselves, you know, is it more expensive for us to tick all the boxes, or is it more expensive for us to, you know, pay the occasional compensation? You know, there's those, I mean, that's the sort of worst case scenario, but there's also situations where environmental regulation gives a very clear list of, or sort of exhaustive list, I should say, of sort of do's and don'ts in a particular context. So you can use a toxin in a certain environment to a certain degree, for example. And what will happen is that you'll end up kind of understandably, if not laudably, you will see, you know, companies trying to game that system. In other words, saying, oh, well, we're not exactly doing that thing. We're doing something a bit different, and therefore we don't fall into this category. Or, for example, oh, well, you know, we're just using this much of this thing in this context, and therefore, you know, we're kind of pushing right to the wire. Now, if you bring into place something that something like ecocide law, and this is where potentially, if it's all right with you, I'll bring in a little bit about the definition of ecocide, because there have been various definitions over the years, but the one that is currently in circulation and that has triggered so much of the political development actually came from a group of top lawyers that we convened in 2020, and that came up, so the first 6 months of 2021, drafting a concise and clear definition of ecocide, and I'll perhaps go through that because it's very short, but I'll go through that in a moment. But what it does is it focuses on consequences. So instead of saying, you know, this and this are prohibited, or you can do a certain amount of X, Y, or Z, what it actually says is the following. So the definition, and it's really quite, the core of it's quite simple. It's ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So it's really quite, I mean, that's the core of it. I mean, there's more explanation of the exact terms, but it's actually quite straightforward. I mean, it's also very legally clear for those that are familiar with international law in that area. The language will be familiar. But what that does is it focuses on how bad the harm is going to be and how much of it there's going to be, rather than exactly what you're doing. And actually, this is very important, because what that does is it encourages people to have, I suppose, what you might call a reality check. They have to then look at the activities on the ground and say, well, how bad is this? Is it going to create severe harm? And so you're actually bringing into consciousness that thing that's not there when people are saying, well, I'm not trying to do this harm, I'm just doing X, Y, or Z. They actually have to say, well, what is this, what is the likelihood of creating severe harm? And of course, at that point, there is plenty of information out there. There's an awful lot of local information, scientific information, all of this information is available as to what kinds of harm are potentially triggered by certain activities. So it creates this sort of nudge for risk managers, legal counsels, operational people to actually be drawing those connections into their minds, and potentially, as a result, asking some very specific questions like, oh, how do we source concrete in a way that isn't going, and they may not have known until they asked that question that there are alternative ways of creating concrete or similar materials. So what, I mean, that's just one example, but it's that way that if you ask the right questions, you can find answers. And that's, I think, a beautiful thing about the human brain, because we do have the extraordinary ability to come up with new solutions, but we don't do it if we don't ask the right questions. And so having a very kind of, if you like, generalized and consequence-based parameter, it triggers precisely that kind of thinking.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think as designers as well, being able to ask those, I mean, just what you're saying there, actually, hopefully will be triggering things in listeners' brains to think, actually, let's ask those questions. How can we source better, or how can we design better, or how can we manufacture those, the concrete blocks? How can we do it better? Let's ask those questions, so that we do have a better outcome. I mean, do you it's in terms, I mean, obviously the built environment is such a massive polluter, and I interviewed Andrew Waugh of Waugh Thistleton Architects, who did the black and white building. It's a mass timber building, it's a beautiful building, and he was explaining how there was, hardly any, if any, residue basically that went into landfill. The noise pollution was reduced, everybody, and they didn't need to wear so much PPE. It was like a beautiful thing, and it's a beautiful building, and it almost like lives and breathes, it's a whole different experience. Obviously, it's totally biophilic.
Yes.
And obviously the natural light and everything else that comes in and that, but sort of in terms of like urban planning, so I've got urban planners as well that listen to this, as well as landscape architects and architects, obviously, and the other designers. But I mean, how can urban planning be part of this solution, and actually, support, the sort of the ecocide movement? What can they do?
I mean, I think there's a few different aspects here. I mean, one is the kind of, is actually having present in one's mind some questions that can, put suppliers on their toes in a good way. So, I mean, even just saying, would you be ecocide law compliant? And they'll probably say to you, what's ecocide law? At which point you go, well, what we see happening, and of course this is happening around the world, there's all these proposals of law going in, and the EU is already heading in that direction, is that, in the relatively near future, there are going to be laws that say, anything that creates severe, widespread and long-term harm is not going to be acceptable. How does that fit with your supply chains? So, there are things like that, and potentially the encouragement of what we suspect will actually emerge, presumably almost as a standard, are we ecocide law compliant, that kind of thing. But there are also, I think, sort of, I suppose, what you might call cultural or attitudinal aspects as well. And I love this term biophilia because, you know, it's you know, this you know, in a sense it's a sort of love of nature in a word, isn't it? And I had this beautiful description recently of what it actually means to love something or to love someone. And in very plain terms, it means to include that person or that thing's interests as one's own. So in other words, it comes down again to what you were saying earlier about this lack of separation. And I think there's a lovely movement that's emerged in the sort of, I suppose it's come out of the rights of nature focus that there's also now growing quite strongly around the world, where and you've probably heard of it. It's, I can't remember what the actual name of the campaign is, but it's where people put a seat on their board for nature. Yeah. Where they have somebody in their sort of directorial group that stands for nature herself, if you like. So for me, sort of in the sort of planning and design arena, there's this sense that, you know, if nature really were my partner, what would nature want in this context? What would actually serve? And of course, it will be different in different contexts. You know, what will serve both nature and people? So that if nature actually had a voice, you know, what would you say about it? And of course, nature is abundant. In principle, nature doesn't do what humans often do, which is to, you know, have the least possible of something to make it work, you know, a sort of, which is actually sort of if you like, a scarcity mentality. It's sort of, you know, certainly I think in the business world we often think in that way. It occurs to me that the corporate PR machine does a rather good job of making us think we need lots of everything, which of course is just not the case. But what nature does is actually very abundant. I mean, you know, when an apple tree has apples, I mean, can you imagine if every single one of those seeds became a new apple tree? No, I mean, it doesn't work like that. You know, there's this sort of sense of abundance. But at the same time, there are parts of the world and particular ecosystems that are A, very fragile, B, very important to, for example, climate regulation. And so when we're thinking about what are the concerns of nature, we should be looking very much at where we're sourcing and how much we're sourcing, because what, you know, and looking at the balance of that in terms of what, you know, where is it that nature is abundant and where is it that actually either that abundance has to be undisturbed because of its function, or that something is, you know, is ultimately more scarce. So I think those considerations become very important. But I also think that what that beautiful kind of connective concept of love, if you like, is also about is actually the presence of nature in our lives, in the built environment, in the interior environment. And you touched on this earlier with, you know, particular aspects of biophilic design, whether that be, you know, sort of you know, buildings with plant, you know, with vegetation on the roof, or, you know, plants in an environment. And of course, that very much directly affects our human health, like our physical health, but also, of course, our mental well-being. And I have to say, I mean, I sort of feel like if there were one educational element that we could sort of somehow make mandatory in all schools everywhere, it's the opportunity to connect directly with nature, because so many, you know, communities, particularly in the urban and built environment, don't have that opportunity, and children don't have that opportunity. And that can be as simple as, you know, a tomato plant in a window box, or, you know, but something that actually kind of connects, you know, and connects us to the life that sustains us. And so I suppose for me, you know, those would be some of the sort of top line things that I would have as kind of filters through which, you know, my design and planning moved, if you like.
That's getting nature connection into schools. There is a movement for that, which is amazing, and there's been some fantastic examples, like the De Verwondering by Olga Architects in Holland, which is like a beautiful school. It's built of wood, and the kids can go outside. There's outdoor classrooms. I mean, you know, if all schools were built like that, and I think the Department of Education are going to ultimately not be moving some way towards that, at least to have more nature connection, which would be amazing. But for me as well, it's about this equity kind of aspect as well, that everybody should have access to it, not just
Mm.
like these new build schools that might be privately funded, but actually, you know, the Department of Education,
Yeah.
you know, particularly inner city schools where
Mm.
land is at a premium, but
Hmm.
we could create things on the roofs. We could create, you know, window boxes, like you say. We could encourage kids to learn about where a potato comes from and grow their own veg, and
Yeah.
nurture something as well, because, you know, there's all this sort of like stress and sort of mental you know, ill health, if you want, in schools with, you know, for different reasons, you know, for children and their families and everything else. But if you're taking care of a plant, we know from like the psychology point of view that we take care of ourselves. It's kind of, we're nurturing something that's living. We have
Yes.
that nurturing to ourselves, and that goes to animals as well. You know, there's sort of the life forces that surround us. We forget that we always think about sort of like trees and plants and things, but actually about the living systems in animals, and actually
Mm.
having that connection and that creating the biodiversity. When
Absolutely.
I interviewed Chris Packham, and he was saying, well, you know, well, he was always like, you know, sort of, and I was like, I was with him so much, and he's saying, well, why don't we put back bricks, and why don't we just do it as like a standard? Why don't we just put them in every single new build? Imagine the biodiversity that we'd have.
Yeah.
All these little things. You know, I mean, we sort of we took looking at the bigger picture, and I think, you know, this bigger picture is like a big sort of jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? Once it's all done,
Mm.
it's
Mm.
but it's all made up of little tiny jigsaw puzzles, and
Mm.
um, I think if we can somehow get, you know, on like the small scales as well, you know, whether that's a
Yes.
local council or whether it's
Yeah.
just a house or a home or a family, to do
Mm.
and build and sort of, you know, do things differently, it's got to have a sort of snowball effect, hasn't
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, I think what we're looking at is both a kind of, I mean, I'm reluctant to use the words top and bottom, but you know, sort of top down, bottom up effect. You know, it's actually, it sort of comes from both sides. I mean, you know, with ecocide law, what we're looking at is, you know, a rule that is almost like the frame of the jigsaw.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, it's almost like saying
Yeah.
like anything within this jigsaw must fit within this frame, i.e., it mustn't massively destroy the ecosystems on which we depend. For very obvious reasons. I mean, from that perspective, it's, you know, the easiest campaign in the world, because who's going to argue with that? Um, and in fact, it seems kind of strange that it's not already there. I mean, a lot of people's, you know, response is like, "What, you mean that's not a crime already?" um, but I think in that context, I love that jigsaw metaphor, because it's like, you know, each of the pieces are required to actually create the whole picture, but that whole picture also needs to sit within, you know, a framework that is safe. And actually, that's one of the fundamental things that is safe, you know, for people and for nature, and that, you know, that is also, you know, life enhancing, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I could talk to you for hours and ask you like a gazillion questions. But I'm actually conscious of the time, and I'm sure you've got to go. But just a couple of things really. If they're designers and architects, planners, suppliers, anybody, families, doctors, nurses, we've got teachers, we've got all sorts of people listen to the podcast. If
Mm.
they want to get involved or support or sort of share the love of the sort of Stop Ecocide law, how can they get involved? You know, are there any opportunities or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of simple things. I mean, obviously, it's, you know, one can join the, you know, if you go to the website stopecocide.earth, there's actually an act now menu, kind of as long as my arm. So there's many different things. But some of the sort of primary things, obviously, you can donate, which always helps. And you'd be surprised how much we get done for what we pull in terms of funding. It's remarkable. We're very what do you call it? Very good value for money.
Yeah.
But perhaps the fundamental thing with this is that it's a conversation. So as I said at the beginning, you know, politicians don't want to stick their necks out on a subject that is not something that people are talking about or or that they care about. So what we would say, and I think this is probably very relevant to your audience actually, is that there are 3 areas where people have, you know, potentially a lot of power to make a difference to that conversation. The first one is policy. And of course, you know, there will be people who, you know, in your network who are interacting with policy. And so, you know, just bringing ecocide law into that conversation and just saying, you know, you know, I hear that this is a really sort of hot topic in the legal world, that it's really progressing, that the EU has been moving towards it, and its latest directive includes things like, you know, just bringing it into the conversation. It doesn't have to be, you know, a big thing that people do, but just bringing that awareness into the policy conversation. And, you know, where policy recommendations are being sought, to say, you know, that, you know, to support the putting in place of an ecocide law. The second area, so policy, the next area is public. So if your organization puts out reports, or it does opinion pieces, or it brings out things in the press, or it runs events, how can ecocide law potentially be included in those conversations, in those articles, in those newsletters, whatever that is, in those reports? It just brings, because it's that thing of acknowledging, legitimizing, and actually just recognizing the importance of, so anywhere that can come into the public interactions. And then of course the third area is private, and that might be private, literally your own personal networks, your family, your social networks. And obviously the more that term is familiarized, that mass harm of nature is described as ecocide, that helps to move that forward, but also the need for the law. But also, when I say private, that could also be your sector, so your particular area of work, whether that's interiors, whether that's paint supplies, whether that's it could be anything, and bringing this into that conversation. So we really love, for example, being invited, like having someone in our team invited to speak at an industry conference, for example, just bringing that in. So it's kind of, which are your membership associations, which are your annual conferences, which are your, publications that go sector wide, and where can ecocide law, or potentially, a short piece or a little op-ed or an interview, or, those kinds of things can be included. And of course, your podcast is exactly one such. But those kinds of things also really, really help. Because one of the things that we've realized is it's not, you never know who you're talking to and where they may have influence and what those connections can lead to. If there's one thing that we've learned, is that connectivity and collaboration are absolutely the name of the game in this conversation building. So, every single person listening to this has that power, in some way. So that's probably the fundamental message that I would put forward.
Fantastic. I always sort of think like the whole collaboration thing is also a bit like sort of trees in a forest and all the mycelium underneath. And
absolutely. We're the mycelium. Let's be the mycelium. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, before I ask you the final question, is there anything else that you'd like to add in particular, Jojo?
Just that I think that, it's really interesting what I found, sort of, obviously talking to so many different audiences around this, is that this is such a sort of fundamental piece, a sort of legal piece. It's like, it feels a bit like a Swiss Army knife. There's a tool in there for everybody. And, it sort of means different things to different people, whether for, those defending the land, for example, it provides a legal tool and a narrative reframe, which is fantastic, and then at the end of sort of, corporate activity, it provides these really useful parameters for sort of provoking the right kinds of questions. It provides a sort of barrier against, the worst sort of, climate exacerbating harms, and there's so many different things. So I suppose it's nice to sort of, it'd be nice to think that, your audience may be hearing that will be thinking, well, actually, yeah, how can I, where is this useful in my particular, toolkit and the way I talk about things? So that, I think, is probably the thought that comes to mind.
Lovely. That's great, Jojo. Well, so the final question that I ask everybody at the end of the podcast: if you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
I think it would depend a little bit where you were. I think it would probably look different in different places. And it would, it would certainly feel very alive. It would certainly involve a lot more interaction between people and nature. And I think for me, it probably comes back down to that definition of love we were talking about earlier that I mentioned, where it's that sense of, if you take nature as a part of yourself and vice versa, as yourself as a part of nature, how does that then affect the decisions that you make? When if those things really are intertwined, as they are, and that you care about the nature aspect, that you love nature and you want to think about how, what is best for nature as well. It's like, it really at that point becomes a relationship. So I suppose for me, it becomes this extraordinary physical manifestation of that network of relationships.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.